Good morning, I'm James Lopez, President at HomeFi Corporation, and this is today's mortgage and real estate market update. We're going to jump right into the headline news of the day. The headline news of the day is the PCE inflation data that was released this morning. PCE stands for Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index, all right, so that's what the PCE is, and it's produced by a section of the government called the BEA, or the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Now, this PCE index is really the index that everybody watches to kind of gauge and see what inflation is doing. And within that index number, there's an index called the core index, the PCE core. That strips away the price of food and energy, and that PCE core index is the index that the Federal Reserve uses to really measure what inflation is doing. So, right into the data that came out this morning, PCE index showed that inflation rose in the month of March by 0.9%. Now that was higher than what was expected. What was expected was 0.5%. All right, and year over year, PCE increased 0.3% to 6.6%. Now on the core PCE rating, it increased 0.3% month over month in the month of March, and 0.1% to a total of 5.2% year over year. So that core inflation came in lower than expected in this report, but the in general inflation number, the PCE number, that headline came in higher than expected. Now, as we've discussed for some time now, inflation is currently the biggest economic concern in the market, and it's being fueled by a few different things, including the war in Ukraine, supply chain issues, and other things like that. Now, specifically in mortgage, inflation is bad for mortgage bonds in general, all right? So inflation is bad for mortgage or bonds in general anyway, because bonds are a fixed rate security, right? So they have a fixed rate of return, and that fixed rate is over a specific amount of time. So as inflation goes up, the return for those bonds goes down in effect. It's worth less, the return is worth less, you can buy less with the return from those bonds. And so that's why inflation is bad for bonds. Now, in order to fight inflation, what central banks do across the country or across the world, and specifically the Federal Reserve here in the United States, what they do is they raise what they call the Fed fund rate. That's what it's called here in the United States. That Fed fund rate is a key factor in how banks lend money to each other overnight. So it's sometimes called the overnight rate or the Fed fund overnight rate. But basically what that does is whenever they start to lift that Fed fund rate, it starts to shrink the amount of excess liquidity inside the economy, and that begins to tamper down on demand. And that kind of moves all the way through the economy down to individuals. So basically they shrink the amount of liquidity in the economy, and demand goes down, and that starts to keep inflation, starts to, tamp down inflation and keep it from spiraling out of control, all right? Now, the Fed fund rate has been very low since the beginning of the pandemic, at historic lows at some points, and so, now they're starting to raise. They've already raised the Fed fund rate once. They're expected to raise the Fed fund rate several times throughout this year, the Federal Reserve is, and that is specifically intended to fight the inflationary action that's going on. Like I said, it's being caused by war in Ukraine, high commodity prices, supply chain issues, all those things that are kind of factoring into inflation. Now, this is where it can become contrary to conventional thought, okay? Because you think, okay, the Fed is raising their interest rates, so interest rates for mortgages are going to go up. But that's not quite accurate, and here's why. Whenever the Fed fund rate starts to go up and liquidity in the economy starts to shrink, it starts to combat inflation. Inflation slows down, and that is good for mortgage bonds. Now, mortgage bonds, the price and demand for mortgage bonds, mortgage bonds are based on securitized mortgages, right, that have an interest rate. That's the rate of return that the mortgage bond is based on. So as inflation goes up, the demand for mortgage bonds goes down because because the yield has less value. And so what happens when that demand goes down? In order for banks to keep their liquidity to be able to continue to do mortgage loans, they raise interest rates so that those bonds can be bought in the secondary market, right? So as the demand for the bonds go down and mortgage interest rates start to go up to create more demand for that bond, and as that bond begins to get bought in the secondary market, then you start to see demand go up for the bond, and as demand goes up for the bond, then you see kind of this pendulum of okay, the rates start to come back down. All right, so as the Fed fights the inflation with the Fed fund rate by raising their overnight interest rates, that starts to fight inflation, and you will start to see demand for the bond, the mortgage bond specifically, will start to go back up. And as that demand for that mortgage bond starts to go back up, mortgage interest rates will begin to fall. So that's the cycle that we're in right now. That's what this, the big news, that's why this was big news this morning about inflation. Now, a lot of times the news that's going to be coming out about this PCE report already is expected. And so the markets do what they call pricing it in, right? So they price it in. But this morning, markets are pretty volatile. So far this morning, mortgage bonds got as low as 60 basis points from yesterday. So they were down 60 basis points yesterday. They've recapped or regained some of those losses. They're down about 30 basis points today. The 10-year yield was up about 5 basis points. Now it's back to zero. Stock futures just a little while ago were looking down. So the market's pretty volatile based on, the PCE data that came out today, even though it was kind of priced in. So there's going to be probably some volatility in the market today as things start to settle from this news from the PCE report. That said, mortgage interest rates are probably going to open up a little worse than they were yesterday, but we could see some repricing throughout the day. It could get better, it could get worse. It just depends on how the rest of the market, just accepts and digests the news from the PCE report today. All right, if you have any questions about all the stuff that we just talked about, please feel free to like and share a comment, ask about it, share a comment on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page. As we always say, this is a discussion, so we'd love to know what you think, and if you have any questions about it. We'll also be sharing some infographics today on Facebook, some related to PCE and some related to some of the housing stuff that's been news that's come out this week. All right, have a happy Friday, and hope you have a great weekend, and we will see you on Monday.